There is often this narrative in the West that Christ in the New Testament rebuked the Pharisees because they were following the law of Moses too strictly and that he had to remove the law entirely. They will often cite this verse, "This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." It is for this reason that Protestants will often accuse Catholic and Orthodox traditions as being Pharisaical, accusing these churches of following traditions too strictly instead of focusing on some sort of universalist relationship with God. However, this understanding cannot be further from the truth, and this interpretation of the New Testament is a mere product of post-Enlightenment theology, and not at all the patristic understanding of Christianity. It is in fact the Protestants who mimic Pharisaical practices. Let us read the same verse again. "This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." When one interprets this verse for what it is rather than in the lens of the Western post-Enlightenment quote-unquote Christian, we see that Christ is rebuking the Pharisees for following their own man-made traditions, not for following the traditions of God as handed down to the prophets. This is indeed the problem that Christ is trying to fix throughout the New Testament. Ever since the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BC, the Pharisees had been twisting the law of Moses with their own ritualistic obsessions, making uncanonical additions to the law that were not from God, but from men. It is these illegitimate rituals that Christ is attempting to remove, not the law of Moses as it was handed down in the Old Testament. For example, the washing of hands before a meal cannot be found anywhere in the Old Testament. It is a ritualistic innovation that the Pharisees added due to their obsessive belief that any physical contact with unclean food would make clean food common. Christ condemns this belief as an innovation, as it is the product of ritual obsession divorced from the actual context of the morality the law is trying to preserve. "And a voice came to him, 'Rise, Peter, kill and eat.' But Peter said, 'Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything common or unclean.' And a voice spoke to him again the second time, 'What God has cleansed, you must not call common.' This was done 3 times, and the object was taken up into heaven again." We see here that God is correcting this erroneous view. Whatever meat God has decreed as being clean should not be called common, even if unclean meat has made contact with it. It is clear then that Christ is not condemning obedience to the law of Moses itself, as long as it is done in the proper context as a moral guideline, but rather he is condemning man-made traditions. From this we can conclude that it is actually Protestants, and not apostolic Christians, who are the Pharisees of modern times, as they have replaced the traditions of the prophets and apostles with their own modernized man-made traditions. Traditionalist Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, and a Syrian Church of the East Christians follow the practices and commandments handed down by God to the holy apostles, in addition to the prophets, while Protestants have invented their own traditions and doctrines within the last 500 years. Far from their orthodox understanding of Christianity in the Middle Ages, the West in the last 5 centuries, ever since the Protestant Revolution, has been twisting the original context of the scriptures with their false doctrines, suggesting outright heretical ideas like pacifism, Marcionism, sola fide, separation of church and state, and countless other innovations. Even the Catholic Church, in the last couple hundred years, has succumbed to such secularist theology, with Vatican II placing the nail in the coffin for its corruption by the modernist agenda. Just as the Pharisees hijacked the Old Testament religion, replacing it with their own perverse interpretation of the law and the scriptures, the secularist West has hijacked Christianity and turned it into something it is not.